Ba-dum-bum, doo-doo-doo, doo-doo, ba-dum-bum, doo-doo-doo, doo-doo, ba-dum-bum, doo-doo-doo, doo-doo, ba-dum-bum, doo-doo-doo, doo-doo. Easy as pie, lemon, apple or cherry. Loving you is so very sweet, sweet, sweet. How can it be such a piece of cake?
So today I wanted to take you through some of our fruiting ground covers, and we figured that we have about 15 fruiting ground covers here. There's a little bit more, but I really want to highlight 15 of them today. And as you may have seen from some of our other garden tours, we really like to pack and fill a bed. We don't like to see any of that bare earth. If we do, it's really intentional to have the bare earth there. But if you have bare earth, you usually have some weeds. And one of the things that I wanted to approach with this bed first, and we're gonna concentrate on this bed because we have a lot of fruiting ground covers here, is that we wanted to use multiple fruiting ground covers that would eventually cover the area. And when we shot this bed originally in the beginning of the year, in the spring, the plants were relatively small and there's a lot of bare earth. And we're starting to see that they're already starting to branch out. And some of the fruits are actually forming. So you'll see with this Prunus pumila, which will be one that I'm featuring, you see some of the flowers, but then you see some of the little cherries that are actually forming here. And I'll highlight those 15 fruiting ground covers because one of the benefits of fruiting ground covers is that they offer, basically trail mix for your wildlife. Now, some of those fruits are ones that you could actually eat yourself. Some are probably not as palatable, but for birds and little beasts, they're definitely edible. And many of these are native, so they could be also provide as good host plants for our native insects, or they could actually be good pollinator plants as well because they have noticeable flowers that will eventually turn into fruit. So that's what we're going to be covering today. All right, guys, so let's go over that list. And by the way, if you hear some rumbling in the background, Sonder is actually trying to put the first coat of paint on the side of the house so that he gets that on before it rains. But let's go through this list. Amelanchier stolonifera, that is my first one. It's also known as running serviceberry, and I had just really discovered it this year. And it's kind of neat because we have serviceberry trees, amelanchiers, these beautiful, kind of like almost like blueberries, but that are a little bit more like pectinous. This is very similar, and the fruit can be used for not only human consumption, but also wildlife and bird consumption, for instance. Now, these are kind of like a higher ground cover because they get 4 to 5 feet high. The ones that I have are actually quite small, but they will also get 4 to 5 feet wide, which is pretty impressive. And my idea is to actually grow these in the orchard so that, yes, maybe we could actually collect the berries, or we could detract wildlife from consuming other berries by allowing them for that. But I really also wanted to grow it in the orchard because I would like to see that offer weed suppression so that some of those weeds don't really come in to compete with the fruit trees that are planted there. So we'll see how that goes. I only have 2 of them. One thing I should note is that they are self-fertile, so you don't need to have 2 of them. But I do generally like to get 2 of a kind of plant at the very least because oftentimes cross-pollination is much better at producing fruits than rather even if something is just self-fertile. So having at least 2 of them and then maybe being able to add to the collection down the line would be great. The other thing that's really nice about this plant is that I believe 124 insects use this plant as a host species. Now that might vary depending on where you are. So I'm in New York, I'm in a zone 5-6, and the species that use that plant, there's about 124 of them. So that, when I think about, providing plants for wildlife, I'm not just thinking about it through the lens of like food for humans or for birds or for even animals, but also an actual host plant for insects, which is something that we often overlook. But those plants and those insects also serve as food for other creatures. So I really encourage you to look at what plants could also be host species plants. One plant that I've highlighted before in the shade garden tour, and I also have it growing in a few other gardens, is Arctostaphylos uva ursi. So it's often called uva ursi or bearberry, and you could probably tell by the common name that this is a plant that produces fruit for wildlife. And it was actually a really important food for Native Americans, but many Native Americans would stew it. So it's not the type of berry that you would eat out of hand. And this is a really interesting plant because it only grows to about maybe 6 to 12 inches high, but it could actually get quite robust, so up to like 6 feet wide. And you could see it growing in kind of dunes or in rocky crags, so it doesn't need a tremendous amount of good soil. I mean, of course, if you provide it good soil, it would probably really much enjoy that, but it's great for rock gardens. So if you wanted to do more of like a native rock garden style kind of garden, then that would be a plant that I would actually probably pick. It's very beautiful, has this kind of like evergreen leaf, and then ours here haven't produced any berries. It's probably too soon for it to produce berries. They're just still very small plants, but I've probably planted, I don't know, maybe like 6, 7, or 8 plants all around different gardens. And one of them in particular in the shade garden is really starting to spread out from where it was, which was just like a small, like 2.5 inch to 4 inch plant that I had gotten. Yeah, and it also grows in shady areas as well if need be. So I think that plant could be really good. It's a great medicinal. I've actually had it tinctured. Uva ursi is pretty good for, your kidney issues, or even anything that may affect the women, like in the menses. So that's a plant that we actually have tinctured here. And I don't think I didn't highlight it. I highlighted it in like the medicine and herb chest kind of tour here. I just mentioned it's not one of those berries that you could eat out of hand. It's much better if it's actually stewed. Also called kinnikinnick. I did not mention that. It's another common name for the plant. Oh, and it's not as prominent as an insect host species as, like, say, the Amelanchier stolonifera, but it is a host plant for about 16 insects. So again, that's something to consider. If an insect is a specialist on a plant, obviously you lose that insect if it doesn't have that genus or species of plant. So even if it's just 16 insects, I would think every insect is noble in its own right. One other thing I should say about Arctostaphylos is that it is self-fertile. So just like the Amelanchier stolonifera, you don't need an extra plant for it to actually produce berries. And that's something that you will really look for if you're looking for a fruit tree and you only have space for one. You would want to get a self-fertile one. And the same thing, when you look at ground covers, you'll want to know whether the plant is self-fertile or whether you should get more than one. All right, I'm going to highlight Aronia melanocarpa, and this is black chokeberry, and typically this would grow as like maybe a shrubby tree, but there have been some interesting cultivars off our native species. So the ones that I'm thinking of are groundhug and lowscape mound. Now, they grow pretty much like 12 to 18 inches high, and they grow maybe about 2 feet across, and they kind of have a little bit more of a floppy leaf character to them. And they haven't produced fruit for me yet, but some of them did flower this year, so I'm wondering if they will produce fruit and whether the animals have gotten them already or not. These are pretty decent as far as food is concerned for both human and animal consumption. I would imagine, making these as a jam would be kind of like pretty good. And there's not many species that actually use this as a host species as far as insects are concerned. There's 2 that are known of here. And again, if you're in a different area or a different zone, you might actually have more insects that use it as a host plant. But for us here, there's only 2. But still, I think the berries are quite good. They kind of look like a little, maybe of a darker blueberry, but they're a bit more pectinous than a blueberry. So highly recommend. I think the new cultivars are quite promising, and they're already starting to spread out quite nicely. And they don't have an interesting leaf, I would say, during like the spring or summer months. They're just like plain Jane green. But during the fall and winter, they could actually put on quite a show as far as color goes. So I think offering, some of those ground covers that are evergreen or that provide like a really interesting berry or drupe or color in the fall or maintaining their green in the winter, those are all pluses in my opinion, because those are things that bring on seasonal interest all year round. I keep on forgetting to mention this, but the Aronia melanocarpa is also self-fertile. So that's a plus because you only need one of them in order to produce fruit, but I have multiple ones that I kind of planted here just to maintain some symmetry in the bed. And I should also say that this plant is used as a medicinal as well. All right, the next one I'm going to highlight is one of my faves. It's Cornus canadensis, and this is one of the herbaceous ground cover dogwoods, and this is native here, as you could tell. Cornus canadensis, typically when it has canadensis, Canada, and it usually extends down through the northeast. But this has like a star-shaped leaf. It spreads by these little stolons or underground rhizomes, and it produces like these drupes, which are basically a bunch of berries together. So very similarly to any type of cornus or dogwood, if you're familiar with the fruits. When I think of fruits of dogwoods, the ones that are most edible are actually a non-native one called Cornus cusa, for example, and they're very popular ornamentals. But imagine this as a much more compact version ground cover. It spreads slowly, but it does spread, and it gets just an amazing kind of red color during the fall. And again, these berries or these drupes, they're not really palatable to humans, but they're perfectly fine for wildlife. And I think that oftentimes a lot of the wildlife will eat the fruits when they have time on the stem. For instance, sometimes like I was even noticing that our robins were eating the Ilex verticillata, which is the hollies, the berries. They left them on until like the last minute of the last hour in kind of like a really early spring or late spring or early spring snow, late winter. And so I think they're probably more palatable than to the birds. But anyway, Cornus canadensis, it's also called bunchberry. It might be called creeping dogwood, and it gets this really beautiful white bract. Again, if you're familiar with dogwoods, they have that beautiful thing that looks like a flower, but it's not really a flower. It's the inflorescences on the inside, which creates all those like little berries, which creates that drupe, and then that white bract on the outside tells insects, hey, there's something really good here to be pollinated. So that is one that I highly recommend. There's a few growers who do grow them, and then after that, they very easily kind of take root, and then you could take cuttings of them after that then and kind of move them around. So that's one that I hope to actually spread more throughout this habitat and throughout my gardens, and I think we have a pretty good start in our shade garden area particularly. Oh, one thing I should say about them is that they're self-sterile, so you do need multiples in order to be able to cross-pollinate. So this is not, unfortunately, one that's self-fertile. You'll need to have more than one. I think I forgot to mention this as well. Cornus canadensis actually has a lot of insect host species. So 129 insects use this plant. So again, you'll think about all the other dogwoods that we have here, and we have tons of dogwoods on this land, which we're really blessed with because it is such a wonderful native. So they will use the regular dogwoods as they will with Cornus canadensis. I don't know if the insects prefer something that's a little bit higher up versus something closer to the ground, but in that case, the Cornus canadensis could serve also as a host plant species for those insects. The next one I'm going to mention is one that everybody will know, and it's Fragaria. It's the strawberry, and there's so many different types of strawberries. There's so many different kind of cultivars and even species of strawberries, multiple ones that are actually native here to the Northeast. And everything about this plant is really wonderful. It spreads rhizomatically. There's 84 insects that actually use this as an insect host species. Basically, the entire plant is medicinal. So when we think about strawberry, we think of the berries, but people will use the leaves as part of a medicinal. People will use the berries, obviously, as a medicinal. So there's just one. It's just really wonderful, and the native one here actually spreads much more aggressively, I would have to say, than some of the cultivated varieties. But the native one also produces a much smaller berry. So a lot of the cultivated varieties have been bred for larger berries, for instance, which is fine by me because I can never have enough strawberries. And we ended up planting probably somewhere between, I lost count, but it was probably somewhere between 300 and 500 different strawberry plants. And my hope is that next year and the following years, they'll produce more than what they actually produced this year. Oftentimes it's just like establishing them and pinching the flowers so that next year they'll actually produce more berries and they spread a bit more rhizomatically this year, which has been the case for many of the cultivated varieties. But yeah, very, very amazing plant, and one that, because it's native here, has a lot of insect host species as well. So as I mentioned, 84 different insects will use this plant, and the whole plant is medicinal. So that is definitely one that I would highly recommend, and of course, one that I think everyone enjoys. One thing I will also say about strawberry that makes it wonderful is that it is self-fertile, but you'll never just want to have one strawberry plant, so you'll probably get multiple anyway. And even if you get different cultivars, my question is, when the cultivars actually mix and intermingle with one another, whether you actually get some really interesting varieties. So time will tell with that. So the next one is one that I'm still orienting myself with, but it seems very promising, and it's Galacacia brachycera. This is also called the box huckleberry, and very similar to a blueberry, but this one is much more low growing, so it could get maybe 1 to 3 feet high and then about 3 feet wide as well. And it produces a little like kind of blackish blue berry, but it's not highly regarded. So if you wanted to go with something that's more palatable, I would say, a blueberry is a regular blueberry or a regular huckleberry may be the way to go. But this is a plant that is used by about 44 insects, 44 insect host species. Ours this year was completely eaten down by somebody. I'm not sure who ate the leaves of the plant, but it's actually bounced back, which is so good because it's a tough year. We had a lot of nibbling on some of our plants. Some of it was the spongy moth. I don't know if the spongy moth was actually nibbling on this, if it was a groundhog, or if it was like one of the 3 deer that was able to get in, or it was like 1 deer and then she fawned in our area. So we had 3 deer within the fence. I'm not sure if they were nibbling on it, but yeah, it's funny because like a lot of times you'll see the plants that get nibbled on are often the more medicinal ones. This one is not considered really a medicinal, or the animals might know something that we don't. But like I said, the berry isn't as palatable. But the fact that it could be a ground cover could also be that it suppresses some of those weeds. And that's when I think about fruiting ground covers. That's what I really think about, is that, wow, how wonderful it can be, that it could provide food for wildlife. It could be an insect host species and could actually, block some of the weeds from coming through. So again, I really think about that. And then this plant is also self-fertile as well. So you only need one of them. But again, if you get 2, 3, 4 or more, then they'll probably produce more berries. But again, this might be something that you might not want to invest in a second plant because you might not be harvesting those berries for yourself. The next one I'm going to highlight is one of my faves, though it doesn't produce like anything that is too phenomenal as a berry, but it's called Gaultheria procumbens. So this is called wintergreen. It's also called checkerberry, snowberry, teaberry, and it refers, I think, to the leaves, because when the leaves are crushed, it smells a little wintergreeny. But I think this makes an excellent ground cover, and it spreads by rhizomes, but it stays fairly compact, has this really beautiful evergreen leaf, and it starts to get like it starts to redden up. And I've planted some during the heat of the summer here, and a lot of the leaves died back. But what is really redeeming about this plant, like many of the plants that I'm telling you, is that they actually have some really nice rhizomes underground that stay alive, and that they're producing out like new little leaves all the time. So if it's just starting to orient yourself to the heat or maybe the sun or anything along those lines, although this is a plant that really likes to be in the shade and thrives in the shade, and they produce these little cute little white flowers that eventually turn into berries. And this has actually been highly cultivated, and I could find ones with pink berries and red berries and white berries. And I guess the berries are a bit more palatable after a light frost, and they'll kind of stay on the plant unless, you know, an animal will actually go and nab them. But this is a plant that only 2 insects actually use as a host species, and it is also self-fertile. But it's like kind of one of those plants that you'd want to get more than one, and the fact that you could maybe see all the different cultivated varieties that are out there. I mean, there might not be like 2 dozen, but there might be like 4 or 5 or 6 different cultivated varieties with different colored berries. But it's definitely one of those plants that I think provides interest all season long. The next one I'm going to feature is actually not a native plant. It's called Lonicera crassifolia. It's one that I actually just discovered this year, and it's a creeping honeysuckle. And this has evergreen leaves. And on our native honeysuckles, we have about, I think, 39 insect species that use it as a host plant. But it's unclear to me whether this plant could help fulfill some of those insect life cycles. And that's typically sometimes what happens. You think that, hey, this is the same genus, but it may not have the same chemical composition as your native ones that have co-evolved with the insects here. So I haven't seen any kind of insects nibbling on these leaves at all. And I don't see many insects actually nibbling on the leaves of some of the Japanese honeysuckles that have become invasive here. This one, I would not want to plant anywhere outside of like a contained bed. I just want to see, I mean, it's not deemed as invasive or anything along those lines at this stage, but that could happen like way down the line. But I'm generally try to be careful with that, but you never know, because if a bird eats the berry, and that's one of those things, it's a blue-black berry. It's not really palatable to me or to humans, but it is something that, you know, birds will enjoy. We actually had a couple that were producing berries. I don't think there's any berries on it any longer, but it does produce a nice little flower. It doesn't have any kind of honeysuckle scent that I've taken note of, but it's like this kind of white creamsicle color flower. But I think the structure of it is really beautiful. It has these really kind of dainty stems and that nice evergreen leaf. It does stay pretty low to the ground, so it's about 6 inches high, but it could actually send its tendrils out to about 2 to 3 feet. And I already see it, it grows pretty, I wouldn't say aggressively, but it just grows well. From when I planted it to now, it's actually grown quite a bit and is kind of tangling in with the rest of the plants, which is actually where I'd like to see it. And what else can I say about it? Oh, it's self-fertile, so you don't need to actually get another plant of it. But again, I brought in a few just to kind of create the symmetry and like let it kind of crawl around on the ground. The next one I'd like to feature is Michella repens, which is called partridge berry or partridge plum. So as you might be able to tell from the common name, this is a plant that's really important to birds. It's also a medicinal, and it's not something, again, a berry that I would say that is something that I would enjoy. And I was looking for our Michella repens, and I'm not sure if it even came up this year. There's been a lot of foot traffic back by the shade garden because we're actually painting the side of the house and the garden goes right up against the house. So if I don't see it come back next year, then I might actually have to replant it, because I think it's just such a wonderful mix in with the shade garden. The other thing that could happen is that it could just be under some other plants, because most of the shade garden plants are some kind of fruiting ground cover or some type of ground cover. So they all will kind of like compete with one another probably for the little bits of light that actually come in there. One thing I will say is that it's self-fertile, but it does need to, it's better if it actually cross-pollinates. So if you're getting one, I would definitely get a second one, just so that it has something to cross-pollinate with. I'm not sure what insects actually use it as a host plant, but I'm sure there's some insects out there that do. I haven't been able to find anything on websites or in the literature about that, but it is such an important food for birds that I think it would probably be somewhere out there for insects important as well. So again, if you're looking into great ground covers for wildlife and great ground covers for shade garden, then that would be one that I would recommend. The next one I'm going to feature is one that I also discovered earlier this year from Coldwater Pond Nursery. So if you recall that tour, one of the ones that I was really excited about was this prostrate version of sand cherry. So this is Prunus pumila var depressa. I've mentioned it multiple times. I've featured it in our orchard. I've also featured it in our acid-loving garden. The berries themselves are actually fairly acidic, but totally edible. And it doesn't need to be in acidic soil, but though it totally is fine with it. And because it's a prunus, there are so many insects that use this as a host species. I believe 455 insects will use prunus as a host species. And again, it may result in leaves looking a little bedraggled during a certain part of the year, but 96% of our songbirds or our birds actually use the larval stages of moths and butterflies, in many cases caterpillars, aka caterpillars, to be able to produce their broods. So I want to actually provide plants that could get a little riddled with insect holes. And this one did. This one totally did. Actually, the one in the orchard definitely got more mangled than the ones closer to the house. Maybe because we're just stay on top of this one, maybe because we water these more, but they're starting to spread so beautifully. And they get about 12 inches high and they can get out up to like 3 feet long. And they kind of just form this beautiful mat. The stems are actually quite strong. They don't spread out like the lonicera or like a cranberry, which I haven't mentioned yet. But they have some sturdiness, I guess, to their stems is what I'm saying. And they have a slightly kind of grayish green blue color tinge to their leaf and a very beautiful flower. So it's a good pollinator plant, like many of these plants are, and a very valuable berry as well. The Prunus pumila var depressa is also self-fertile. So again, you don't need to get more than one plant for it to be able to pollinate and to basically produce fruit. So I think all around, this is a plant that I absolutely adore. And it seems to be growing extremely well. We'll see how it deals with the winter. I mean, it is native here and it is fine for a zone 5. So I'm kind of eager to see how it will pass through the winter months, which I hear is going to be a pretty long, hard, and cold winter. Don't mark my words, but that's what I've been hearing, and that's what I'm kind of guessing from the Canada geese already flying back south for the winter. The next two I'm going to highlight are in the genus Rubus, and one is Rubus arcticus, and that is one that I actually got from, I believe Logis actually carries it, and it's Arctic raspberry, and it's actually medicinal. The leaves are actually used as a tea. It doesn't produce a ton of fruit. So if you want a plant that is going to be very fruitful, this may not be one of them, but I think it's a really cool plant to have. Again, I have this growing in the orchard. I also have it growing in the shade garden, and it has this kind of lighter color leaf that I think is really attractive and that actually stands out in kind of shady areas. Now, there are quite a number of insects that use our native rubus as a host plant. So there's 164 species that use our native rubus as a host plant. I don't know if some of our insects could actually use this as a host plant. Again, when it's not super native to our area, then I don't know if our insects have co-evolved to eat that plant. But it's one that I think is interesting enough, and we have lots of native rubus that are out here. So adding this to the mix in one of our gardens, I think is a no-brainer. And I have eaten the fruit. It's decent, but like I said, it's not really bred for the fruit, so it's not as tasty as some others. Now, the second rubus that I want to talk about is Rubus calicinoides. And this is an interesting plant. I was first growing this plant in Brooklyn in the back garden area of my community garden, and it's kind of got this cool leaf. It's a bit more quilted. It has a kind of fuzzy, hairy leaf. It's much stiffer as a plant, and it kind of spreads out. It has a beautiful sprawling habit. The one that I have here is quite small, and I think because it's under a shady area, it's actually growing a lot slower, unless I'm not giving what it needs. But typically you could find it in kind of rocky rocky or sandy terrain, actually, so where it is native to. And it produces a nice little berry that's quite tasty. I can't tell you whether it's self-fertile or not. I've definitely bought more than 2 plants. Typically, like I said, when I get plants, I'll usually get at least 2 because I'm never certain oftentimes whether they're self-fertile. Sometimes I have to go and like read the literature to see if it is. But it's a really beautiful plant. I love the color of it. I love the texture of it. I think that it has this kind of more like paw-shaped print. Well, a little bit like a rubus leaf, but also a little bit like an acer leaf, shaped like a little animal paw that I think is quite nice. And again, the habit of it is really nice. Now, because this is not a native plant, I can't tell you whether the 164 insects that use rubus as a host species can use that one. I haven't seen any insects on it, so they probably don't understand it. But it does produce a nice little berry, and I would probably grow more of it if I had the option, and I might get some more next year. One that I would like to highlight is one that is growing native here, but there's many cultivars. Vaccinium angustifolium, one of the cultivars that we're growing here is called Brunswick, and this is called low bush blueberry. And this is a blueberry that only grows to about 1 foot high, and it'll grow maybe 2 feet in length. And Vaccinium is really common around here. I mean, it needs acidic soil. We already have acidic soil to begin with, but we usually have to acidify the soil some more. But I've noticed when walking back into the woods, there's quite a lot of low bush blueberries. Now, I haven't been back there enough to see if they're actually producing fruit, because they are kind of like in this little opening, so they do get some light in there. And but I walked out and I noticed that our Vaccinium had a couple blueberries, but if you're not on top of it, we don't have enough blueberry plants that if we're not on top of it, somebody else is going to definitely get those blueberries. But I didn't predict that they would actually fruit a lot this year, especially because it was very dry. And the blueberries got crushed by somebody. Somebody was eating the huckleberries and the blueberry leaves and the top stems. So, and then we weren't on top of it. We didn't know who was doing that. It could have been our groundhog. It could have been the deer, who very well knows. But again, this is a great native pollinator plant. And also 295 insects use this as a host species plant. Highly recommend it. Maybe not the easiest to grow if you have alkaline soil or if you even have neutral soil, but you could really amend that soil. You could watch the soil acidifier episode of some of the acid-loving plants, and you could get some ideas for that as well, because it's not too difficult to grow them if you know what to do. So that's one that I would highly recommend. And the next 2 that I'm going to highlight are also Vaccinium, so they're in the same genus. So the second to last one that I'll highlight is Vaccinium macrocarpum, and the cultivar name is Stevens. I was about to say the brand name. The brand name is Stevens. This is another plant. It's our common cranberry, and it's a creeper. And it's a creeper. And I have this actually growing in the orchard. It's growing really well. It's in like full sun. I have it growing in this back garden here, which does get some sun. And I actually had it growing towards the lake, the half lake over here. And I don't think that they've really survived well there. They seem to be better in this kind of full sun, like high compost area. So I'm just gonna go with that. I mean, I may try it in the more boggy areas. When I think about cranberries, I actually think about cranberry bogs. In fact, there's bogs here. I haven't taken you on a tour yet, though. I really wanna go. And that you could actually get your own cranberries out of the bog, which is so fun. It's like you're on a big, like billowy water mattress. Now, these are berries that, I guess you could eat them out of hand, but they'd be very tart. If you ever think about cranberry juice that's not sweetened, it's like pretty tart. Obviously a really great medicinal. People use it to kind of clear, if somebody had kidney stones, they always tell you to drink cranberry juice, things along those lines. So it is a great medicinal. It's much better stewed. So that's like one of those berries that you'd have, during Thanksgiving, and you'd stew it. You'd maybe put like some like orange or lemon zest in it, and then you put a little bit of sugar to make it, again, more palatable. But you don't need a lot of sugar. You don't need a lot of sugar to make it more enjoyable. In fact, I like the tartness of the berries, and I'd like to grow more of that. And you do need more than one. I think with a lot of the vacciniums, you should plant more than one because some are self-fertile and some are not. And you never know which ones you get to pick. So if you get one, get multiples because then you're more likely to actually see berries. The last one I'll mention is not one that's native here, but I have really grown to love, and I've just started growing it, and I ended up getting multiple plants because I like the taste of it so much. Very similar to the cranberry, and it's Vaccinium vitis idea. And I was saying it incorrectly, so thank you for those of you who are telling me that my pronunciation was off. I was calling it lingonberries. It's lingonberries. I was even spelling it. This dyslexia kind of threw me off with the N and the G, but lingonberries. And I have been getting lingonberry jam. I've also been giving it to the birds. The birds seem to absolutely love it. They're now starting to actually produce fruit. You should have more than one to have it self-fertile. And they produce these cute little like white flowers, very similar to the obviously blueberries because it's in the blueberry grouping, the blueberry genus. And the pollinators seem to absolutely enjoy it. And the berries, you kind of got to get them before the birds and other animals actually get them. But I'd like to actually produce more of these plants in order to be able to collect them and make some jams out of it. It's probably now one of my favorite jams. We just used it on some of our homemade pancakes, which is absolutely delicious. And again, it's not too sweet. It has this kind of tartness to it that I absolutely adore and enjoy. And again, that is not a native species here, but in that Vaccinium group, 295 insects actually use that as a host plant. So whether they could cross over and fulfill their life cycle on that plant, I don't absolutely know. And I think that as we start to observe some of these plants over the years, we'll be able to see if we see more insects that kind of gravitating towards those plants and eating the leaves. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely more fruit and ground covers that I have, but I think those are some really redeemable ones. And again, we're in a zone 5, zone 6. So I'll try to put the growing zones of all the plants underneath their names just so you could get a sense of where they grow and whether it would actually grow in your zone as well. But if you're growing others that you've deemed very interesting, even if it's from an ornamental point of view, or if there's ones that you would recommend that produce like a ton of berries or a ton of drupes, then let us know in the comments below because I think it'll also be very helpful for others as well. But I hope you enjoyed that episode. Again, thank you so much guys for supporting our channel. As you know, 10% of our proceeds go back into the projects here in the Finger Lakes. We were able to give back to a CSA, to Muddy Fingers Farm, for folks who are not able to fully afford the CSA, but they want fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's really awesome. We were able to do that because of viewers like you. So again, thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you want to see new videos when they release, just hit that notifications button and we'll see you in the next video. All right, guys, bye.